Let's go. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. The checks are b3 check. Solution to the puzzle is d3. Rook to e7. f5. Rook to c7 check. King to d4. King to b3. King to e3. Let's continue. The threats are rook takes pawn check. Rook takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn check. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are rook takes pawn check. Pawn takes pawn check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Pawn takes pawn check. King to h8. Bishop takes pawn check. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are queen takes pawn. The checks are bishop to f5 check. Queen to f5 check. Queen to c2 check. Queen to c1 check. The answer is bishop to f5 check. b4. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop check. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are rook takes knight. Rook takes knight. The checks are rook to f8 check. Rook to g3 check. Rook to f4 check. The best move in puzzle position is h5. Knight to g3. Rook to f8 check. King to g2. h4. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn check. Checks in this position are queen takes pawn check. Queen to e3 check. Queen to c1 check. Answer to this puzzle is c4. Rook to f5. Pawn takes bishop. Rook takes queen. Rook takes queen. Next puzzle. Threats in this position are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is rook to f4. e5 check. King to d3. Pawn takes rook. c7. Rook takes knight. King takes rook. Pawn takes bishop check. King to d3. Pawn takes pawn. Promotes to queen check. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using d4. King to f4. g5 check. Another one. Here are the threats. Bishop takes rook. Rook takes pawn check. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are bishop to a7 check. Rook takes pawn check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop takes rook. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. g4. Rook to e2 check. King to f3. King to e1. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes knight check. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes knight check. Queen to d5 check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight to f5. g6. Queen takes knight check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The answer is queen to g7. Rook to g1. Rook to h8. Queen takes rook check. Queen takes queen. Let's continue. Threats in this position are rook takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using rook to g6. b6. Rook takes queen. Pawn takes queen. Rook takes rook check. King to h2. Rook to f8. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn check. Queen takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Checks in this position are rook to g1 check. Queen takes pawn check. The puzzle is solved using knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Rook to d6. Knight to d2 check. Rook takes queen. Knight takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Knight takes queen. Next, the threats are. There are no threats in this position. The checks are g5 check, e5 check. Answer to this puzzle is e5 check. King to e3. Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. King to e6. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to a1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to c4. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. One more. The threats are. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to d5. g4. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. One more. The threats are. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Here are the checks. Knight to e7, check. Rook takes rook, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook takes rook, check. King to h7. Knight to e5. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. King to d5. a4. King to c4. b3. Pawn takes pawn. a3. King to c3. a2. King to b2. Promotes to queen, check. King takes queen. Another one. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. f5. h5. h4. c5, check. Pawn takes pawn. Next puzzle. The threats are. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. h5. Knight to e2. Bishop takes pawn. Knight to d4. a4. Another one. Threats in this position are. Rook takes rook. The checks are. c4, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook, check. King takes pawn. b4. Pawn takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to f6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Bishop to f6, check. King to h7. Bishop to g7. Queen to e6. Knight to g5, check. King takes bishop. Knight takes queen, check. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to c1. Queen to e7. Queen takes pawn, check. One more. Threats in this position are. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. The checks are. Knight to e7, check. Knight to f6, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen to h8, check. The answer is. Knight to f6, check. Queen takes knight. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Next puzzle. Threats in this position are. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. Bishop takes knight. e4. g5. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.